Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq. Joining us for the segment, Ryan McCormack, factor and core equity strategist over at Invesco, to discuss weekly performance in the Nasdaq-100. We'll also take a deeper dive into inflation data. It's great to see you as always, Ryan. Welcome back to Trade Talks. And let's take a look at weekly performance. We actually strung together some green days.
Yeah, thanks, Jill. It's great to be back, and yeah, a handful of green days. QQQ and QQQM up 7.36% for the week. Outperformed the S&P 500, which is up 4.34%, and the S&P 500 value up 2.3%. You look over the course of the week, and it was categorized as risk being on. Constructive inflation data kind of bolstered markets, gave some optimism that the Fed eventually at some point will loosen policy. You saw CPI release last Thursday. The Nasdaq-100 jumped by 7.49%. That's the largest one-day up move since March of 2020. So, and then yesterday, despite headlines on geopolitical risk, what's going on in Russia and Poland, you saw some contagion issues, shockwaves in the crypto world with BlockFi potentially mulling a bankruptcy after FTX. We still saw Nasdaq 100 finish higher by nearly 1.5%, and that was after the PPI for October came in softer than anticipated. So, despite all the headlines, despite all the noise that's out there, it gave a very clear indication that the market is focused mostly on inflation.
Yeah, and let's talk about that for a bit here. If we take a look at the 2-year and the 10-year and how rates are being impacted as inflation data starts to cool off just a bit.
Yeah, and cooling off is kind of the key word here. You have CPI year over year at 7.7%. So that came in last Thursday, below estimates for 7.9% year over year increase, and down from 8.2% in the September reading. Now that's the first time year over year inflation has been under 8%, according to the CPI, since the February reading. And then you look at the core, which excludes food and energy, also came in lighter than expected at 6.3%. That's down from 6.6% in September. The PPI, 8% year over year, lighter than the estimates for 8.3% and down from September's revised 8.4%. And that was the smallest reading that we've seen since July 2021. So from a forward-looking perspective, the hope is that inflation has peaked and we're starting to see a retreat. But you kind of need to pan out to a longer-term chart. And we have a 10-year chart of CPI and PPI. And it just kind of puts in perspective that we have kind of a ways to go here, which underscores Powell's comments about how a pause is not really on the table, right? They need to see more progress against inflation as they try to rein it in closer to that 2% target. Fed funds futures, they've moderated slightly for the week. Last week, we kind of saw 56 basis points priced in for the December meeting in terms of a hike. Now it's kind of hovering just under 50 basis points. So, that being said, the first rate cut is expected June or July of next year. So we're not really expecting a fully dovish pivot. We're not expecting a pause for rates, but as inflation continues to cool off, potentially we could see some easing monetary conditions down the road.
All right. My apologies. I said 2-year and 10-year rates. I meant to say 2-year and 10-year CPI and PPI data. Key distinction there that we certainly have to make. And Ryan, let's wrap up here and take a look at the sectors that were leading the way.
Yeah, again, a great week for QQQ. All sectors in QQQ and SPY were in positive territory. Every sector in QQQ outperformed its counterpart in SPY, and relative performance driven by Q's largest overweight sectors, technology and communication services, happen to be the best performing sectors in both QQQ and SPY. From an individual company standpoint, I just thought it's interesting when you look at some of the positioning. So only 11 names in QQQ or the Nasdaq-100 were in negative territory for the week. 8 of those 11 have been in positive territory for the year. And one of them is down less than 2%, clearly outperforming the broader strategy. On the other hand, you look at the 10 best performing stocks of the week within QQQ and the Nasdaq-100. Well, 8 of them are within the worst 12 performers for the year. So I realize that's a mouthful, but what we're seeing is kind of a reversal of year-to-date performance. Names that have been under pressure for much of the year, they're starting to see some interest. You're starting to see folks position portfolios, take an interest in some of these names that have been beaten up, and maybe, as risk comes back on, we're starting to see some of the winners of the year, folks take some off the table and reallocate there. So a little bit of a reposition. And then the last point, just in terms of individual companies, NVIDIA is expected to report Q3 earnings tonight. So we'll have something to talk about next week. week.
We certainly will, Ryan. Appreciate the insight as always. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.